Alright guys, we are going to go through our chapter 21 section 1 notes on living things in the environment. You should have made a copy of this, and if you're ready to go, we will begin. So, some different things that we want to go through. We're going to look at different levels of organisms in the environment and how they interact. So, a prairie dog, this is our example, is considered one type of organism, which is considered to be a living thing. So living things include plants and animals. They need water, oxygen, food, all of that to survive. So that is considered an organism. Then, different types of organisms must live in different types of environments. And there are different components in those environments that help those organisms to survive. So an organism needs to obtain food, water, shelter, and even other things it needs to survive, to be able to live, grow, and reproduce from its environment. And if it doesn't get those things, it would need to find a new location to live, or adapt to its environment so that it could survive and still meet its basic needs. So an environment that provides the things an organism needs to live, grow, and reproduce is called its habitat. So where it lives is its habitat. One area may contain many different habitats. There's different organisms, different needs. So depending on what they need, there's different habitats. Okay, so they have different requirements for survival. So the prairie dog obtains the food and shelter it needs from its habitat, and it couldn't survive if you moved like a prairie dog to a tropical rainforest or along an ocean shore, or if you move them to like the tundra where it's really cold. They couldn't survive because it doesn't have the things they need. Then, a prairie, the same way, prairie wouldn't meet the needs of a spider monkey who needs to live in a tropical area, or like a hermit crab who needs that ocean. So there are different factors in environments. To meet its needs, the prairie dog has to interact with more than just other prairie dogs or other like members of its species. So the organism interacts with both the living and the non-living parts of its habitat. So the living parts or other organisms such as plants and other animals are called biotic factors. Then the abiotic factors are the non-living parts of an organism's habitat. So those things that are non-living are considered water, sunlight, oxygen, so like the air and the other gases in the air, and even soil and what soil is composed of, and like rocks and things like that. So, some specific information about water, which is that abiotic factor. All living things require water to carry out their life processes, and water also makes up a large part of the bodies of most organisms. So, in humans, for example, our body is made up about 65% water, and then our cells are mainly water, and we need that to function and survive. Plants and algae also need water, and they need that along with sunlight and carbon dioxide to make their own food in a process called photosynthesis. And then other living things depend on those plants and algae for food, and they eat that, and so they get the water back from eating those plants and algae. Sunlight then is also another important abiotic factor. It's needed for the process of photosynthesis, so plants can make their own food, and they can also produce oxygen, which is something that we then need to breathe. And so, places that don't receive sunlight, then plants and algae can't grow. So, there's really no food sources for other animals, or they have to adapt to that different surrounding. Then oxygen is another abiotic factor, or like the air and other gases that we breathe. But oxygen is very important because it helps us carry out our life processes. It helps human bodies breathe and function, and humans can only live a few minutes without oxygen. Um, so that's like our blood circulating and moving that oxygen around so our organs can function and we can stay alive. So then organisms that live on land obtain oxygen from the air, so we breathe it in. And the air is about 20% oxygen, and then it's mixed in with a bunch of other different gases. And then fish and other water organisms that live in water still obtain oxygen that's dissolved in the water around them, and they breathe it in through their gills. Temperature is also another abiotic factor, um, and they are typical of an area and determine the types of organisms that can live there. So, like we said, you couldn't take a prairie dog and put it in like the tropical rainforest because there's different temperatures, there's different um, abiotic factors there, there's different types of food, all of that. Same with like you couldn't take um, like an Arctic fox who lives in the tundra and put it in the desert. It wouldn't survive and it doesn't have the food sources there. So there are some animals, though, that alter their environments so that they can survive very hot or very cold temperatures, or they have special adaptations to help them live and function in their environment. So prairie dogs, they dig underground and they make tunnels and burrows so they can live in. But that also provides shelter then from the hot summer because the ground is cooler and they can kind of just hang out there. And then it also helps them in the cold winter as well because the ground and that temperature is more regulated instead of being on the surface. So the other abiotic factor then that's important is soil. And soil is considered a mixture of rock fragments, nutrients, air, water, and even the decaying remains of living things. So there are different types of soil, and even in different areas, the different materials in soil affect what types of organisms can interact there. And it influences the kind of plants that can grow. So many animals, again, such as the prairie dogs, use the soil as homes. So they burrow and make tunnels. And then there's even microscopic organisms such as bacteria that live in the soil and function and help break down the decaying remains um, and just help put nutrients back into the soil. So, with populations, then, in the 1900s, travelers saw a prairie dog town in Texas that covered an area twice the size of the city of Dallas. So, that town contained more than 400 million prairie dogs, and they had all different tunnels and burrows and nests all throughout that area. So these prairie dogs were all members of one species or a single kind of organism. They were all the same type of prairie dog that lived together. So a species, as a reminder, is a group of organisms that are physically similar and they can mate with each other and produce offspring that can also mate and reproduce. So all the members of one species in a particular area are referred to as a population. So that 400 million prairie dogs in Texas are an example of a population. They are all the same species of prairie dogs. Um, all the pigeons in New York City make up a population because they are all the same species of bird that are in that location. And then all the bees that live in a hive are also considered a population because they are all that one species of bee living and working together. Now, the example that's different is if you look at all the different trees in a forest. It's not just all one type of tree in that area. You have different species of trees, so they don't make up a population. You could have like pine trees, maple trees, birch trees, oak trees, all different kinds, all mixed in that area. So when a particular area contains more than one species of an organism, it's considered a community. So the prairie includes prairie dogs, but it also has hawks and different types of grasses. There's badgers and snakes, and there's even many other different types of organisms. So all those different populations or all those different species that live together make up a community. Now, a community is still looking at the species and those living organisms that are all together. So, to be considered a community, different populations or those different species have to live close enough together to interact with each other. So, like a prairie dog might eat different insects or could eat grasses, but then the hawk might also eat the prairie dog, and they're interacting. So they might also use the same resources, such as food or shelter. So the tunnels dug by prairie dogs can also be used for burrowing owls or for ferrets. Snakes sometimes also go into the tunnels as well for shelter, and then prairie dogs share grass with other animals and eat that for food. But then prairie dogs are also food for other species, such as those snakes and those hawks. So once you get past a community, the community of organisms live in a particular area. When you add in those non-living surroundings or those abiotic factors such as water and sunlight and the soil, it makes up what we call an ecosystem. So a prairie is just one type of ecosystem, and there's other ecosystems that have different um, organisms and different abiotic factors that change what it's considered. Um, so other ecosystems in which living things make their homes could be like mountain streams, deep oceans, evergreen forests, and those even we get into next chapter are called biomes because they're in different areas and biomes combine multiple ecosystems. So, looking at the levels of organization then within an ecosystem, it's important to remember that it goes from smallest level to largest level. So, the smallest level of an organization is the single organism, so that single prairie dog, and then that belongs to a population, which includes other members of its species, but they're all similar. And then the population belongs to a community of different species that are still all living. And then that community and the abiotic factors all form an ecosystem. So, because the populations in an ecosystem interact with one another, any change that might happen to that area is going to affect all the different populations. So, if you like take away the prairie dogs or something eats all the prairie dogs up, it's going to change what other animals live there or what happens to the grasses and things might grow or other organisms might leave the area or come in. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the study of how living things interact with each other and with their environment is called ecology. And then ecologists are the scientists who study ecology. So it's like the study of the environment or the study of ecosystems. Once you're done with these notes, if you need to go back and fill in anything, please make sure you rewind the video and get all your notes completed and submitted. Otherwise, you are good to go.